Привет, друзья, с вами Кирилл Павлов. Недавно Казахстан захлестнула целая волна паводков. Конечно, для многих это явилось настоящим бедствием. Это не первый ЧС, который я освещаю, наверное, 9 или 10 уже. И в этот раз я подключился заранее с учеными. Мне удалось спрогнозировать, предсказать, в каких населенных пунктах, когда и насколько примерно поднимется вода. Увы, но на некоторых каналах меня уже называют эксперт по катастрофам. Сегодня я решил выпустить интервью с настоящим экспертом по катастрофам, с другом из США Томом, человеком, который был советником Буша, Обамы, отвечал за цифровизацию, ЧС, за прогнозирование, за превентивные меры. И поверьте, это очень интересно. Ну, не буду вас отвлекать, слушайте. У меня такой вопрос. Для начала, не могли бы вы рассказать о своем опыте и ролях, которые вы занимали в правительстве, связанных с управлением чрезвычайными ситуациями?
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. In terms of my background, I'm a laser spectroscopist who became a businessman. And after I sold my fourth high-tech company, I was asked to help the United States government in developing working models to alleviate problems that the US government was seeing with its partners for mitigation of disasters. And what we did is I decided to go to two places to work. I went to the US Department of Homeland Security because it was a young agency and they were in charge of mitigating many of the potential disasters in the United States, as well as working at the White House to spread what we did at Homeland Security across the US government and military. And I chose DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security, because it was a relatively young agency at the time. And what we did is we developed actionable strategic plans. Many governments and organizations develop a strategic plan, and as we would say, they put it on a shelf, and that's where it stays. But we developed actionable strategic plans, as well as detailed operational requirements and concept of operations, what a user needed to do with a certain technology or method that we would develop to solve a problem. So what I focused on is defining problems in details, as well as how the solutions would be used by end users, in this case, the US Department of Homeland Security, and eventually virtually every agency in the United States. I'm a little embarrassed to say I've written 30 books. Most of them are textbooks, and they involve the development of detailed operational requirements, concept of operations, and most importantly, the commercialization of technology to meet the requirements of a multitude of different scenarios. So that's how I came to the government.
Thank you, Tom. Второй вопрос я бы хотел задать насчет ваших самых серьезных вызовов, с которыми вы сталкивались во время вашего пребывания в должности в области вот, управления как раз чрезвычайных ситуаций, и как вы подходили к этим трудностям.
Yes, one of the
About
things that I found when I went to government is that there were very capable people, but there wasn't a lot of activity in terms of writing down the detailed operational requirements. Requirements define problems, and specifications define solutions. I would see general phrases and terms used in the government about trying to handle a problem, but what was needed to actually solve problems were detailed operational requirements, and it was is called concept of operations, how people would use technology in most cases to solve these problems. And what was very clear to me is that the US government, in this particular case, was not effectively utilizing interaction with the private sector. The private sector is ready, willing, and able to help governments, not only in the United States, but in countries all over the world, if they are given two things, neither of which is money in the beginning. The first thing is to provide detailed operating requirements. They want a definition of the problem. And the second was to provide a basic outline of what the potential available market of the solutions would be. And I found it incredible how many in the private sector was ready and willing and able to help us. So what I did very early on is work on public-private partnerships that were win-win, win for the government and win for the private sector. And what I found is that the private sector, at their own costs, would share new technologies, new capabilities to meet our needs, and they would even pay for third-party independent testing. And what we would do is provide them a certification that their product or service met our needs, and we would certify their product. And for the private sector to share in the imprimatur of the US government, that was worth more than gold to them. And they were able to then sell their products, market their products all over the world because the US government said their product or service worked. So it was that simple premise that allowed me very quickly to get the private sector to help the US government. And we created a certification program at Homeland Security called the Secure Program, which now is, by different names, is spread all over the US government. And now public-private partnerships are being used all the time to alleviate and reduce and mitigate disasters that the United States government and others find very often.
Thank you. Thank you. Возвращаясь к паводкам, Том, я бы хотел спросить, какой личный опыт, какие вызовы вы принимали на себя, какой у вас был вообще опыт борьбы с этими событиями и по вашему наблюдению, ну, как различные правительства в разных странах борются с этим?
Yes, to your point, floods are a very challenging issue, and we face them on a regular basis. There are 7 operating components of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and FEMA was responsible for a lot of work in terms of mitigating flooding. And I'm sure people all over the world remember the problems in New Orleans and other parts of the world. And again, what we learned with flood mitigation was to have actionable strategic plans that we updated regularly. We already had pre-negotiated relationships with the private sector. We did training with the private sector and government people to make sure that we could mitigate a flood scenario. And again, I had written 2 books that dealt with floods as well as other issues like that, dealt with what we called in the United States key infrastructure and critical resources. And there are 2 books that I had written, which are still very popular and used in the government, which we gave many examples of detailed operational requirements, concept of operations, and how we formulated a very unique and very successful certification program for the private sector to help us. and it's worked out beautifully. And again, it is spread now all throughout the US government and many of our partners throughout the world who we taught how to use this.
Thank you. Спасибо, Том. Информация вот о чрезвычайных ситуациях при пожарах. Мне кажется, очень бы интересно было послушать, какой опыт непосредственно вы имели в реализации стратегии смягчения последствий пожаров и какие ключевые моменты вы считаете наиболее эффективными, на что нужно обратить внимание?
Many of your audience heard me say that I'm a laser spectroscopist or a laser physicist and a businessman. But what I've also been for over 45 years is a firefighter. I've been a fireman, a volunteer fireman, we call it in the United States, a member of the first responder community. So fires have a special meaning to me. And I will tell you that, again, we developed very actionable strategic plans for different types of fires. And I'm a firefighter with specialty in two areas. One is what is called structural fires. That's buildings, structures, things of that nature. But I'm also a forest fire person. And so I have lots of experience actually working in the field when I was with the US government in working in fires, many that you would remember from the California fires in the United States. So I would go to these fires and actually develop in the real time, watching the other firefighters and people trying to mitigate the disaster, to develop detailed operational requirements, in other words, define some of the problems I saw, as well as develop the concept of operations of how firefighters would use these technologies and tools. So it has a very important meaning to me to mitigate fires, because I've been very proud to be a first responder fire person. And I, again, have written a textbook specifically for first responders in dealing with fires and other major events that we dealt with at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and across government.
Good, good. А по поводу технологического прогресса, как вы считаете, Том, как он изменил мир и как правительство сейчас справляется с чрезвычайными ситуациями, такими как наводнения и пожары, с учетом нового технологического процесса?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. And absolutely, I've been, to this day, very proud of our small team that had made real changes in our government. And I give a lot of thanks to both President George W. Bush and President Obama, both of whom I worked for in the White House, as well as the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. They gave me the freedom to develop these unique models that are still in existence today. I mentioned the Secure program at Homeland Security. That has spread all over the United States government and military, and the other agencies across the US government and military use different names other than the Secure program, but it's basically that program that has been utilized by their groups. And again, the most important aspects is getting the private sector involved. Government can't do everything. And as I mentioned, the private sector is ready, willing, and able to help the government if it gives it two things: detailed operational requirements, a definition of the problem, and as well, a potential available market, not a promise of a market, not a promise to buy anything, but just an opportunity. When you think about it, my friend, think about all the money that is spent by the private sector around the world in trying to ascertain or understand what the potential available markets are. Here, when you have a government sharing the markets and the market applications, giving them a market analysis, not a promise, but show them this saves them time and money. And it was an honor for them to get invited to work with us. And in fact, they used the money that they saved to put it into third-party independent tests and evaluation to get a certificate for their product or service, which enabled them to sell more product in all the markets they serve in the private sector and elsewhere, because they had the US government saying this product or service worked. People were pleasantly surprised at how effective this was. In fact, one of the first detailed operation requirements I wrote was at the request of then Secretary Chertoff of Homeland Security. He was very concerned about people bringing explosive onto public transportation like buses, trains, and things. And he tested me. And we wrote detailed operation requirement. It only required about 1.5 pages of how to monitor and to see someone, observe someone who was trying to do something on a bus or a train, etc. And as one of the requirements, he wanted the price of such a tool to be fairly low, like only $650, when at that point, Homeland Security was paying $20,000, $30,000 for a camera. He wanted something less than 650 US dollars. Well, I wrote the 1.5 pages, and within 3 weeks, we had many companies come to us. And about a month later, he said, well, how are we doing on that detailed operational requirement, thinking that no one would have responded? I said, we already have 4 prototypes, but I'm sorry to disappoint you. We're not at the $650. He said, well, I know it. That's a very low price. I said, we're at average at $243. And he was astonished. So he said, $243. And it was that technology. You may have remembered hearing in Kazakhstan about the Boston Marathon bombing, where people bombed and killed many people. It was that technology with those systems that was so low cost that buildings all around the United States and elsewhere were able to afford to put those explosive resistant cameras all over their buildings. It was that technology that caught the 2 people that left those bombs. And I'm still very, very proud of that, is because we were able, with the help of the private sector, to make several different models at low cost that were certified, that ended up catching those people in the Boston Marathon bombings. So the process works.
Thank you. Том, вот отталкиваясь от вашего опыта и от вашего богатого опыта, как вы считаете, какие наиболее распространенные упущения допускали государства при планировании действий, либо при активных действиях в чрезвычайных ситуациях, и на что стоит обратить больше всего внимания?
Well, we talked about this a little bit, my friend. I think the biggest problem I see is people think they write a strategic plan and they put it on the shelf on their desk. And that's the last time they look at it. And I'm a real believer. I run many businesses now. I'm on many boards of directors of companies. And I believe in living or actionable strategic plans. You need to take them out at least every quarter. You need to review them. You have to have others review them and work together with people that would be the recipient of this actionable strategic plan to make sure that they understand what you're planning to use in case, God forbid, of a disaster, and get their input. So I used to spend a lot of time with the heads of the agencies in the US government, the White House, and the military in looking at those strategic plans to make sure we were providing detailed concept of operations, detailed operational requirements, and also already creating partnerships with the private sector in the event of a disaster. So we didn't wait to create partnerships once the disaster happened. We already had partnerships created, and we already had certified products and services ready to deploy to meet those disasters. And it worked beautifully.
Спасибо. Том, учитывая, ну, все-таки, опять же, опираясь на ваш богатый опыт, какие рекомендации вы могли бы дать на сегодняшний день для общих стратегий реагирования на чрезвычайные ситуации? Что бы вы порекомендовали, как можно улучшить?
Yeah, this is a very important point, and for your audience, I wanted to put down the 10 most important best practices that I think anybody involved in disaster mitigation needs to be concerned about and needs to think about. And one would be risk assessment and planning, understanding potential risks, and use the private sector as well. We have an expression in English, many heads are better than one. So get a lot of input in terms of risk assessment and planning. The other is training and drills. We would work with the private sector. We would work with other agencies. So Homeland Security, we would work with other agencies in the US government in drills and practicing. This was important. And we had a lot of interagency coordination. I would spend a lot of time going to talk to other agencies, Health and Human Services that were needed in a disaster, and other agencies within the US government so that we could all have a coordinated effort and each agency knew what its role was in mitigation of a disaster. The other is community engagement and education. Do you know, in our country, the United States, there are over 25 million first responders. And a first responder, according to Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 8, are people not only like police, firefighters, EMTs, but it's people that work in hospitals, that work in power companies. All of these people are important in a flood, in a fire. So you all need to bring them together so to share the strategic plans and get everyone, as we would say in English, on the same page to deal with catastrophes or disasters. Technological integration is so important, Carol, because you want to be able to use the latest technology, for example, to map fires, to look at flooding, predictive technologies. So need to keep abreast of what's available out there. Resource management, that you would have some inventory of products or capabilities that you can deploy immediately upon something happening, not wait until after the disaster happened and then you're trying to figure out what to do. It's a very frustrating, time-consuming effort. Planning is 80% of handling a disaster, not waiting for it to happen, but planning for it. Incident command systems we put into place in different regions. If something were to happen, who would be in control of the command and control, the operations of getting something done? So, for example, in the California fires, CAL FIRE would be the agency in charge of running the mitigation of the fire, but there were people like me from Homeland Security helping to fight the fire. We had prisoners. We had prisons set up where prisoners were being taken out of prison to help us to get the manpower. We had foreign governments who are our partners. We would help them on disasters. They would help us to mitigate a disaster. And flexibility and adaptation. You have to be prepared in your strategic planning. If something goes wrong, you would always have a backup plan. Post-incident evaluation. We would have, we call them debriefs. Once we addressed a problem or tried to mitigate a disaster, we would take lessons learned. What would we do differently? How would we do this differently next time? And we would keep very copious notes and update our strategic plan on what we learned. And finally, resilience building, which by that I mean looking, for example, the two books I wrote on critical infrastructure and key resources. The reason why I wrote a second book is because we learned so much in some of the disasters that we saw with electric grid and other things. And by the way, the private sector got very involved in that. Why? Because over 75% of critical infrastructure and key resources were owned by the private sector. So they had a vested interest in being able to mitigate. So these are the 10 most important things to think about when looking at mitigating disasters.
Спасибо, Том. Я очень надеюсь, что ваши бесценные советы, ваш громадный опыт, конечно же, окажут нам большую поддержку. Кто-то, надеюсь, увидит, сделает выводы. Огромное спасибо, благодарность за ваши рекомендации.
My friend, it was a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope this has been helpful. And please have any members of your audience contact me if I can help them at all. And good luck to you and all my friends in Kazakhstan who I have many fond memories of, and I certainly enjoy all my trips in the past and in the future with Kazakhstan. God bless everyone, and good luck.
Всем спасибо, друзья. Поставьте лайк, подпишитесь на канал и напишите, как вы считаете, может ли Казахстан позволить себе такие меры, которые предлагает Том, и нужно ли нам подключать иностранных специалистов, или нам достаточно своих